Woodsong by Gary Pualsen, Chapter 7. We have had and been owned by many dogs since we started to run them. We borrowed many initially because we did not have dogs, and they came and went, ran for us a while, then belonged to someone else. And they were loved while they were with us, and missed when they left, whatever the reason. Indeed, at the time of this writing, we have 41 dogs, counting the joyful madness we call the puppy pen, and each dog has taught us much. There is this dog named Fred who has lived with us for going on 9 years. When he first came to live with us, he made several sled dogs pregnant, and so we had him altered. He is loose and moves freely through the kennel, stealing food as he goes. The upshot is that between the operation and the uncontrolled eating, Fred has become enormously fat. His weight for size should be about 40 pounds, and that would be a shade heavy. Fred came to weigh over 130 pounds. He was so heavy his legs sometimes collapsed under him, so we put him on a diet, and that is when I began to see and understand temper in dogs. It was not easy to place restrictions on Fred. He was smarter than us. As soon as we started the extreme weight loss regimen, Fred began showing up with bits and pieces of food he buried all around the yard and kennel over the past year. We took that away and began taking the food the sled dogs had buried as well, because Fred was stealing them. Fred still had more, food that he had hidden in the barn, and when we took even that away, he began to steal tomatoes and potatoes from the garden. Finally, when we fenced the garden and forced him to go on 2-mile walks by dragging him on a leash, Fred began to lose weight. At the same time, he lost his temper. Always a well-minded dog, he stopped coming when we called, he quit his normal watchdog duties, he'd always been a good barker if somebody drove up, and took to sitting in the yard, staring at the house. Then he bit me. Fred had never been one to bite, although he could be very single-minded in his thinking. One unforgettable incident with the electric fence illustrates his persistence. When we first put the wire in, it was just high enough to catch his tail, which he carried curled up. In due course, he clipped the wire, and the jolt put him down. In a flash of rage, and with a mighty bellowing growl, Fred turned on the wire and bit it, and was promptly knocked off his feet. Again, before I could stop him, he bit the wire, and again he was knocked down. On the third try, he backed off and thought about it. I figured he was done until he sat up and hit the wire running. Once more, it hammered him, but his momentum carried the day, and he broke the wire. Whereupon he stood, wet on it, and walked away growling. Indeed, he still growls at the wire when he walks by. He sticks to a thing, but he isn't vicious. Yet, he bit me. He studied the house, figured I was the reason for his discomfort, waited until I was walking across the yard, and lifted my kneecap as deftly as a surgeon. It put me on my hands and knees, and he moved off a few feet and sat, watching me, panting quietly. I got the message, and we fed him, small amounts, still almost starvation, but something, and Fred returned to his formal, cheerful self. Although I limped past him cautiously for several months, he never popped me again, but I learned to watch the dogs for signs of irritability and temper. Different dogs, of course, have different tempers. Some are more short-tempered than others, but on one occasion I had a whole team mad at me. It made for a wild ride. The thing is, it started gently enough. My leader was a sweet dog named Cookie, and I had 6 dogs, all cheerful. It was on the trap line. I had checked several sets, and the weather had turned sour. By late afternoon, there was a full storm, blowing snow so hard it was impossible to see where we were going. The dogs always know direction, but this was before I learned to trust them, learned to understand that lead dogs know more than the person on the sled. Afraid I would get lost in the storm, I challenged every decision. If Cookie wanted to go left, I wanted to go right. If she wanted to go right, I wanted to go left or straight ahead. Each time she persisted, overriding my commands, I scolded her for fighting me, and each time I would find later that she was right. Still, I did not learn, and I continued to challenge them, often causing the team to get tangled. In time, they grew sick of my idiocy. When I went up to pull them over, floundering in the deep snow, they ignored me, tried to shrug away from my hand. Still trying to be partially polite, they let me know I was being a plutz. And still I persisted. Finally, I went too far. We were running along the top edge of a long ridge, higher and higher. The wind was tearing at us. I had my head buried in my parka hood and couldn't even see the front end of the team, but I was sure I knew the ridge, knew where we were, felt that I had been there before. I was absolutely dead wrong. The team went slower and slower until they were walking, lugging up the middle of the ridge, and perhaps after a quarter of a mile, they stopped. I yelled at them to turn right. Gee is the command for right, haw for left. I knew where we were now, was sure of it, but Cookie tried to turn left down a long, shallow incline. I became furious at their mutiny, swore, yelled at the team, then stomped forward, grabbed Cookie by the back of her harness, and half pulled, half threw her off to the right. She vanished in the driving snow and wind, moving angrily in the direction I had thrown her. The team followed her, and I jumped on the sled as it went by. For 1 or 2 seconds, it was all right. I stood on the brake and held the sled back, and we slithered down the hill. Then it all blew apart. With a great lurch, I felt the sled fly out into empty space and drop beneath me. I barely had time to fall backward and go into a tuck before I hit the side of a nearly vertical incline and began to tumble. I flapped and rolled for what seemed like hours, end over end. I heard the dogs falling beneath me, the sled rolling over and over, and all the gear and food being tossed out, crashing around me. With a resounding thump, the whole pile, sled, dogs, gear, and me, upside down, plummeted into a heap in the bottom of what seemed like a deep gully. It was impossible for a moment to understand what had happened. There was not a place where I ended and the dogs and junk began. One dog, named Lad, had his nose jammed squarely in my mouth. Another was in my armpit. The sled was on top of me, and if you'd asked me my name, I couldn't have told you. Cookie had knowingly taken the team over the edge of a sharp drop. It was something she never would have done on her own. But I had pushed and gripped and hollered too much, and she thought it was time to give me a lesson. If I wanted to be stupid, if I persisted in being stupid, if I just couldn't resist being stupid, then she figured I had it coming, and she wouldn't hold me back. It was a good lesson, but it wasn't over yet. I stood and shook the snow out of my clothes. It was actually packed to my ears and tipped the sled upright. It took me 15 minutes to find all the gear and repack the sled, and the dogs watched me quietly the whole time. When the sled was loaded, I set to work on the dogs. They were an unholy mess, tangled so bad the gangline was in knots. The dogs were strange. While I worked to untangle them, it was almost as if I weren't there, as if a robot was working on them. They were pleasant enough, but they did not make eye contact with me. They looked straight ahead while I untangled them. They almost, but not quite, ignored me. Even the dogs that would normally be jumping all over me held back. It was eerie, quiet even, with the wind blowing over the top of the gully. But after a moment, I dismissed it as all in my head and went back to the sled. I pulled the snow hook and stood on the runners, and the whole team lay down. They did not drop instantly, but each and every dog, as if by silent command from Cookie, dug a bit and made a bed and lay down in the snow and went to sleep. I tried every way I knew to get them to run, fed them, begged them, bit their ears, but they completely ignored me. I wasn't even there. They didn't get up for 18 hours. I had gone over the line. In the storm, in the pushing and yelling and driving, I had passed the point where they would accept me, run for me, pull for me, and they told me there in that gully. In that wild place, they told me so that I would understand that they were the team. They were all of it. And if I ignored them or treated them wrong, I would know it. Finally, I pulled out my sleeping bag and made a camp of sorts and heated some tea and dozed and drank tea and thought of how it is to be stupid. And later, when they felt I had enough, late the next day while I was still in the sleeping bag, Cookie stood and shook the snow off. The rest of the dogs did the same, shook and marked the snow. I got out of the bag and fed them and packed and stood on the sled, and they pulled up and out of the gully like a runaway train. They pulled up and into the sun and loped all the way home in great joy and glee, joy they were happy to share with me. Unless I grew stupid again. It is always possible to learn from dogs, and in fact, the longer I'm with them, the more I understand how little I know. But there was one dog who taught me the most. Just one dog. Storm. First dog. He has already been spoken of once here when he taught me about heart and the will to pull. But there was more to him, so much more, that he, in truth, could take a whole book. Joy, loyalty, toughness, peacefulness, all of these were part of Storm. Lessons about life, and finally, lessons about death came from him. He had a bear's ears. He was brindle-colored and built like a truck, and his ears were rounded when we got him, so that they looked like a bear cub's ears. They gave him a comical look when he was young that somehow hung on to him even when he grew old. He had a sense of humor to match his ears, and when he grew truly old, he somehow resembled George Burns. At peak, he was a mighty dog. He pulled like a machine until we retired him and used him only for training puppies until we let him loose to enjoy his age. He pulled his back over in the power curve so that nothing could stop the sled. In his 4th or 5th year as a puller, he started doing tricks. First, he would play jokes on the dogs pulling next to him. On long runs, he would become bored, and when we least expected it, he would reach across the gangline and snort wind into the ear of the dog next to him. I ran him with many different dogs, and he did it to all of them, chuckling when the dog jumped and shook his or her head. But I never saw a single dog get mad at him for it. Oh, there once was a dog named Fonzie who nearly took his head off. But Fonzie wasn't really mad at him so much as surprised. Fonzie once nailed me through the wrist for waking him up too suddenly when he was sleeping. I reached down and touched him before whispering his name. Small jokes, gentle jokes, Storm played. He took to hiding things from me. At first I couldn't understand where things were going. I would put a booty down while working on a dog and it would disappear. I lost a small ladle I used for watering each dog, a cloth clove liner I took off while working on a dog's feet, a roll of tape, and finally a hat. He was so clever. When I lost the hat, it was a hot day, and I had taken the hat off while I worked on a dog's harness. The dog was just ahead of Storm, and when I kneeled to work on the harness, he chewed almost through the side of it while running. I put the hat down on the snow near Storm, or thought I had. When I had changed the dog's harness, I turned and the hat was gone. I looked around, moved the dogs, looked under them, then shrugged. At first, I was sure I put the hat down, then I couldn't find it. I became less sure, and at last I thought perhaps I had left it at home or dropped it somewhere on the run. Storm sat quietly looking ahead down the trail, not showing anything at all. I went back to the sled, reached down to disengage the hook, and when I did, the dog exploded forward. I was not quite on the sled when they took off, so I was knocked slightly off balance. I leaned over to the right to regain myself, and when I did, I accidentally dragged the hook through the snow and pulled up my hat. It had been buried off to the side of the trail in the snow, buried neatly with the snow smoothed over the top so that it was completely hidden. Had the snow hook not scraped down 4 or 5 inches, I never would have found it. I stopped the sled and set the hook once more. While knocking the snow out of the hat and putting it back on my head, I studied where it had happened, right next to Storm. He had taken the hat, quickly dug a hole, buried the hat, and smoothed the snow over it, then gone back to sitting, staring ahead, looking completely innocent. When I stopped the sled and picked up the hat, he looked back, saw me put the hat on my head, and I swear smiled. Then he shook his head once and went back to work, pulling. Along with the jokes, Storm had scale eyes. He watched as the sled was loaded, carefully calculated the weight of each item, and let his disapproval be known when it went too far. One winter, a friend gave us a parlor stove with nickel trim. It was not an enormous stove, but it had some weight to it and some bulk. This friend lived 12 miles away, 12 miles over 2 fair hills, followed by about 8 miles of an old abandoned railroad grade. We needed the stove badly. Our old barrel stove had started to burn through, so I took off with the team to pick it up. I left early in the morning because I wanted to get back that same day. It had snowed 4 or 5 inches, so the dogs would have to break trail. By the time we had gone down the hills and the railroad grade pushing in new snow all the time, they were ready for rest. I ran them the last 2 miles to where the stove was and unhooked their tugs so that they could rest while I had coffee. We stopped for an hour at least, the dogs sleeping quietly. When it was time to go, my friend and I carried the stove outside and put it on the sled. The dogs didn't move, except for Storm. He raised his head, opened one eye, did a perfect double take, both eyes opening wide, and sat up. He had been facing the front. Now he turned around to face the sled, so he was facing away from the direction we had to travel when we left, and watched us load the sled. It took some time as the stove barely fit on the sled and had to be jiggled and shuffled around to get it down between the side rails. Through it all, Storm sat and watched us, his face a study in interest. He did not get up, but sat on his back end, and when I was done and ready to go, I hooked all the dogs back in harness, which involved hooking the tugs to the rear ties on their harnesses. The dogs knew this meant we were going to head home, so they got up and started slamming against the tugs, trying to get the sled to move. All of them, that is, but Storm. Storm sat backward, the tug hooked up but hanging down. The other dogs were screaming to run, but Storm sat and stared at the stove, not at me, not at the sled, but the stove itself. Then he raised his lip. bared his teeth, and growled at the stove. When he was finished growling, he snorted twice, stood, turned away from the stove, and started to pull. But each time we stopped at the tops of the hills so the dogs catch their breath after pulling the sled and stove up the steep incline, Storm turned and growled at the stove, the enemy, the weight on the sled. I do not know how many miles Storm and I ran together. 8, 10, perhaps 12,000 miles. He was one of the first dogs and taught me the most, and as we worked together, he came to know me better than perhaps even my own family. He could look once at my shoulders and tell how I was feeling, tell how far we were to run, how fast we had to run, knew it all. When I started to run long, move from running a work team, a trapline team, to training for the Iditarod, Storm took it in stride, changed the pace down to the long trot, matched what was needed, and settled in for the long haul. He did get bored, however, and one day, while we were running a long run, he started doing a thing that would stay with him, with us, until the end. We had gone 40 or 50 miles on a calm, even day with no bad wind. The temperature was a perfect 10 below zero. The sun was bright, everything was moving well, and the dogs had settled into the rhythm that could take them 100 or 1,000 miles. And Storm got bored. At a curve in the trail, a small branch came out over the path we were running, and as Storm passed beneath the limb, he jumped up and grabbed it, broke a short piece off about a foot long, and kept it in his mouth all day and into the night. He ran, carrying the stick like a toy, and when we stopped to feed or rest, he would put the stick down, eat, then pick it back up again. He would put the stick down carefully in front of him or across his paws and sleep, and when he awakened, he would pick up the stick, and it soon became a thing between us, the stick. He would show it to me, making a contact, a connection between us. Each time we stopped, I would pet him on top of the head and take the stick from him. He would emit a low, gentle growl when I took the stick. I'd examine it closely, nod, and seem to approve of it, and hand it back to him. Each day we ran, he would pick a different stick, and each time I would have to approve it. And after a time, after weeks and months, I realized that he was using the sticks as a way to communicate with me, to tell me that everything was all right, that I was doing the right thing. Once, when I pushed them too hard during a pre-Iditarod race, when I thought it was important to compete and win, a feeling that didn't last long, I walked up to Storm, and as I came close to him, he pointedly dropped the stick. I picked it up and held it out, but he wouldn't take it. He turned his face away. I put the stick against his lips and tried to make him take it, but he let it fall to the ground. When I realized what he was doing, I stopped and fed and rested the team, sat on the sled, and thought about what I was doing wrong. After 4 hours or so of sitting, watching the other teams pass me, I fed them another snack, got ready to go, and was gratified to see Storm pick up the stick. From that time forward, I looked forward the stick always, knew when I saw it out to the sides of his head that I was doing the right thing, and it was always there, through storms and cold weather, on the long runs, the long, long runs, where there isn't an end to it, where only the sled and the winter around the sled and the wind are there. Storm had the stick to tell me it was right. All things were right. And it came to Storm to grow old. 8, 9, then 10 years, and he slowed. He trained many pups, and finally he retired and stopped pulling. We tried to make him a pet and move him into the house, as we often do when dogs retire, but he didn't want that, didn't want to leave the kennel. He rattled around in the house and kept trying to walk out through the windows and glass doors. So we let him outside and kept his food dish full and left him untied. For a year, Storm was the old man in the kennel. He sat in the sun and played with the pups and watched the teams leave and come back, and always he had a stick. He would hold the stick when I came out to the kennel to harness and when I returned from a run. And another year passed, and he grew blind. His thinking changed so that he was not always aware, but still he was happy. He sat by his house, and when he heard my steps coming, he would hold his stick out for me. Sometimes I would go to his house and sit next to it in the sun, and he would lay his head in my lap with the stick in his mouth, and I would think of things I had forgotten about. Young things and old things, long runs and short runs, puppies and cold and wind, northern lights and the firelight against the snow, the creaking sound of an old-fashioned leash sled moving beneath me, and the joy, the raw, cold joy of going again and again inside the diamond that is northern winter. And all was Storm. And there came a time when it was supposed to end. Storm failed and began to wander aimlessly through the kennel, bouncing off other dogs' houses, and I knew it would not be long until he faced east, as many of them did when they died. I wanted to leave him loose for that, so that he could find the right place. But we had some new dogs, and some of them were aggressive and insecure and wanted to fight all the time. They would even almost fight old Storm when he came too close to their circles. Though it was very rare for young dogs to attack older dogs, more respected ones, I did not want Storm to end that way, in violence. So when I went on a trip, one fall day, I left Storm tied to his chain. It was a temporary thing, just until I got back, but while I was gone, it came on Storm to end, and in the final time of his life, he somehow got the chain wrapped around his doghouse so that he could not face east, could not do it properly. I saw where he had struggled and torn at the ground with his old claws to get around, to face east as so many animals do if there is time in the end, but he could not. He could not tear the chain out of the ground, could not wear it around, could not move the house, could not face the east and end it right. And it was my fault. I should have known that this was the day he would end, should have felt that he was going to die. I should have known to let him loose, even if there was a risk of a fight. After all, it would be natural for him to fight. They love to fight. But I did not. It was my fault. And when death came and Storm could not face east, he knew that I would be upset. Storm knew I would feel bad, and he did the only thing he could do. When I came back the next day, I went to the kennel and there was silence until I came close, and then the dogs went into the death song, which sounds much like the rain song, and I knew then Storm was gone. Before I saw him, knew before I even arrived at the kennel. It is a low song that stays low and does not go into the kneeing whine that means excitement, and I felt all the sadness that comes with the end of a life and went to take his body from the kennel and bury him. I found him next to his house. He had jammed into the side, trying to get around to the east. The earth was torn beneath him. The chain held his head north, but he didn't blame me. I will always blame myself, but Storm did not blame me. His last act, his last thought was for me. Storm lay dead, and in his mouth was a stick. The stick. Our stick.